My grandson, I have lived a long life, and I know that my time will soon come. But there's something I need to tell you about my past. I was a member of our independence movement, and I played a role in helping India become a free country. You see, India was a colony owned by Great Britain for a very long time, and it was primarily a relationship that was harmonious, but it was a relationship of Indian expense for British profit. Our people paid one of the highest prices ever paid by mankind for our freedom. In our language, it is called Bengal Akal, but in English, it is called the Bengal Famine, and I was a witness to it. Now, I'm sure you wonder what happened during the famine. I was a teenager when it all happened, and I saw many awful things. I watched the son of my neighbors slowly and gruesomely die of starvation. His parents were dying as well. It was a terrible thing to see, and this was just the beginning of the famine. I remember that dying people whose bodies laid in the streets were starved and skinny. Bones protruded from their flesh, and skin so tight that it appeared to be like parchment paper. Children ate yam stems, vines, leaves, and grass, sometimes even dirt, out of starvation. Dying people cried out onto the winds for the starchy water that rice had been boiled in, only to receive nothing and no help. Dogs and jackals feasted on piles of bodies in Bengal's coastal villages. The ones who escaped were men who migrated to Calcutta for jobs, and women who were forced to do the unthinkable and sell their bodies and their children just to feed themselves. Mothers had turned into murderers of their own children. Fathers had turned into traffickers of their own daughters. Village belles had been turned into whores out of desperation. Communities had been decimated and stripped of all humanity. At the height of the famine, almost 300 people were dying gruesome and painful deaths every single day. Now, I'm sure you wonder, how did I, of all people, manage to escape? By order of King George V, enacted by I, Winston Churchill, to be executed by Field Marshal Archibald Wavell. Your first duty is the defense of India from Japanese menace and invasion. Owing to the favorable turn which the affairs of the King Emperor have taken, this duty can be best discharged by ensuring that India is a safe and fertile base for the British and American offensive. But I have to make sure that they promote peace in the area. Peace, order, and a high condition of wartime well-being among the masses of the people constitute the essential foundation of the forward thrust against the enemy. The material and cultural conditions of the many peoples of India will naturally engage your earnest attention. But of course I'll need to address the shortages. The hard pressures of World War have, for the first time for many years, brought conditions of scarcity converging in some localities into actual famine upon India. Now, my grandson, you see, at home, there was no way for us to possibly grow our own rice because the paddies had been destroyed by cyclones and war. So, we had no way of producing any food for ourselves. There was a drought that also swept through the area and destroyed any crops that were still remaining, and British speculators then came and bought out any remaining rice that we had to further fill their stores back home, even though they had plenty. I decided that I had no choice but to escape to an island called Nicobar. Now, you might ask yourself, why would I decide to go to Nicobar Island? Well, you see, my aunt and uncle owned a self-sustaining farm on the island that I could live off of there. Their food stores had not been affected by the cyclones or the government seizure of crops. That way, all their food was still intact and all their crops still remained. When I arrived at Nicobar Island, I was starving, skinny, and dying. My aunt and uncle had to nurse me back to health, and I was weak for several months. But eventually, I got back on my feet, and I decided to return back to the mainland. Now, why go back to a place of such destruction? I had caught word over the radio of a man who was leading protests and leading people and spreading hope across the entire colony of India. He was leading protests to rid India of the British Raj, the government system that had brought war, famine, and death upon us. You may have heard of the man who led us. His name was Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi led protests across the entirety of India, and his goal was to remove the British Raj from India completely. Now, Gandhi had been a freedom fighter already since 1929, and most people had forgotten. But I happen to know that Gandhi had been leading protests like the Salt Protest and the Civil Disobedience Protest. Gandhi spent 17 years fighting for our freedom. At the height of the protest that he was leading, he gave a speech that I will never forget for as long as I live. Nowadays, people call it the Quit India speech, but it was a speech that brought national attention to our struggles and our movement. But it also brought persecution to us as well. You see, by order of the British Raj, nearly 60,000 of our members were arrested and detained. And the more prominent members were executed. The same British Raj that executed our friends was the same British Raj that brought war, famine, and death upon all of us. It seemed like there was no end in sight. But after a long period of protest and fighting, blood, sweat, and tears, the British Raj were finally considered trespassers in India on August 15th, 1947, and they were required by law to withdraw at 11:59 p.m. that night. After all the fighting and all the persecution and all the blood and sweat and tears, our country was finally free. But there were many, many poor decisions made by the British government. There were ships that passed through the Bay of Bengal, and Winston Churchill ordered them not to stop and not to drop off food to us. It doesn't seem reasonable to strip our troops of the food they need to fight the war. But India's starving. I don't have another choice. Every effort must be made, even by the diversion of shipping urgently needed to deal with local shortages, to help aid war efforts. But besides this, the prevention of the hoarding of grain for a better market and the fair distribution of foodstuffs between town and country are of the utmost consequence. No form of democratic government can flourish in India while so many millions are by their birth excluded from those fundamental rights of equality between man and man upon which all healthy human societies must stand. Signed, Winston Churchill. You see, my grandson, Great Britain decided not to help us, even though they could. We had had to watch our loved ones die of starvation. Great Britain made so many choices, and we could have been spared all of this misery and all of this death. Churchill even admitted later to have been biased against our people, against our culture, and not having seen us as equal. Churchill decided not to send the ships to India. They burned our rice ports, and they burned our rice paddies. I do believe that the success of our independence movement is attributed mainly to the famine itself happening. You see, the people desired change, and the fuel for that desire was the famine. The people wanted change, and they decided to rally underneath Mahatma Gandhi and give him the support he needed to succeed in his movement. Gandhi led us into an era of freedom and peace. Remember, my grandson, fight hard when we are in crisis, and fight even harder, even though we may not be. Remember to speak up and speak out for those who have not had their voices heard, and maybe then our world may see some good.